Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time we're diving into Patrick Bet-David's CPAC 2025 speech. It seems like you guys really wanted us to cover this one, so
Oh, yeah, it generated a ton of buzz online.
yeah, a lot of strong reactions for sure. And right off the bat, he makes this pretty bold statement.
Definitely.
He says that tyrants are really only afraid of two things: armed citizens and free speech.
It's a provocative claim, no doubt. He then goes on to share two of his own recent experiences to kind of illustrate this point.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how he connects these personal stories to, like, these broader historical and political trends. It's not just like random anecdotes.
Right, there's a definite through line there. It's like he's trying to paint a bigger picture.
Exactly. Okay, so first up, he talks about this interview he did with one of the founders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
Heavy stuff.
Yeah, and Bet-David claims that this founder basically admitted that, like, their top priority right after the revolution was taking guns away from citizens.
Which really speaks to a key part of his argument. This idea that disarming the population is like a classic tactic for authoritarian regimes.
Right, taking away the means to resist.
Exactly. It's about consolidating control, removing any potential threats.
And to hammer that home, he brings up how, relatively peaceful the Middle East was before the Iranian Revolution, and then all the chaos and conflict that came after.
Right. He seems to be suggesting a link between an armed citizenry and stability. Like maybe when people have the means to defend themselves, it creates a sort of deterrent against tyranny.
It's a complicated issue, for sure, but that's definitely the core of his argument.
Definitely. Then he totally switches gears to Brazil.
Yeah, out of nowhere.
He was interviewing former President Jair Bolsonaro, who was facing potential imprisonment at the time.
It sounds kind of intense.
Oh, it is. He talks about being advised to have an international lawyer on standby, traveling in an Arbon truck, maintaining a huge security detail. It's like something out of a political thriller.
And then not long after that interview, Bolsonaro gets hit with charges and a possible 38-year prison sentence.
That's wild.
Bet-David uses this whole ordeal to highlight just how fragile free speech can be, especially in a country where he sees the courts and lawmakers leaning heavily in one political direction.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back. He specifically calls out a Brazilian judge, Alexandre de Moraes, and labels him a tyrant at the highest level.
Wow, strong words.
And he doesn't stop there. He compares what's happening to Bolsonaro with the pushback former U.S. President Donald Trump has faced.
So he's seeing a pattern here.
Right, like there's this global trend of silencing dissenting voices, particularly those on the right.
Okay, so we've got gun control in Iran, potential silencing of political opponents in Brazil. Where does he go from here?
This is where things get really interesting. He brings up the statistic that the U.S. Constitution is the oldest in the world.
Which I have to admit I didn't know.
Right? It's not something you think about every day. But he contrasts that with how often constitutions change in other countries, especially those with weaker commitments to individual liberty.
He throws out some numbers that are pretty stark, like the Dominican Republic has changed its constitution 32 times, Venezuela 26 times, Haiti 24 times.
Yeah, it makes you think.
It does. So what's his point with all this?
Well, he's arguing that the U.S. Constitution's longevity is a testament to the enduring principles of freedom it embodies, especially the Second Amendment's right to bear arms and the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech.
He sees them as like the foundation of American liberty.
Exactly. And he believes that tyrants both here and abroad are constantly trying to chip away at them.
Okay, that makes sense. And then he brings in a whole other layer, his personal faith journey.
Yeah, this is where things take a more spiritual turn.
He talks about finding God while serving in the U.S. Army, and even raises the question of divine intervention in American politics.
It's definitely a different angle. He's using his own experiences to suggest there might be a higher purpose behind American exceptionalism. It's a powerful way to frame his message.
It is. So he's weaving together these personal experiences, historical observations, and spiritual beliefs to kind of build his case. But does he offer any solutions? I mean, what are we supposed to do with all this?
That's where his call to action comes in. He urges listeners to be paranoid, but in like a positive sense.
What does that even mean, paranoid in a positive sense?
It's more about being vigilant and proactive. He's saying we can't afford to be complacent. Freedom isn't a guarantee. It's something we have to actively protect and defend, even in a country like the U.S. with strong constitutional protections.
So we can't just sit back and assume everything's going to be okay?
Exactly. He even compares it to a basketball game. You can't just celebrate after scoring a few points. You got to keep playing hard until the final buzzer. The fight for freedom is ongoing.
And what does that fight look like, practically speaking? Does he give any specific advice?
He emphasizes the need to recruit new voices to the cause. He mentions people that Bobby Kennedy, Tulsi Gabbard, Elon Musk, Joe Rogan, as examples of individuals who challenge the status quo and bring fresh perspectives.
So he's looking for people who aren't afraid to shake things up.
Right, people who are willing to stand up for what they believe in, even if it's unpopular.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Gun control, silencing of dissent, the fragility of free speech, the U.S. Constitution, divine intervention, and a call to action. It's a lot to process.
It is, and while his perspective is certainly passionate and thought-provoking, it also raises some important questions. For example, how do we balance security with individual rights? Can freedom truly thrive in a world facing so many complex challenges and evolving threats? These are the kinds of questions worth grappling with as we navigate this increasingly interconnected and uncertain world.
It definitely makes you think about the world a little differently. It's almost like he's urging us to step outside our comfort zones and re-examine our assumptions about freedom and what it takes to maintain it.
Absolutely. And that's what's so fascinating about this deep dive. We're exploring ideas that challenge us, that provoke us, and ultimately help us understand the world a little bit better. But the real question is, what stands out to you from this exploration?
For me, it's the idea of being paranoid in a positive sense. It's such a striking phrase. I'm still wrestling with what that means in a practical sense. Does it mean being hyper-aware of potential threats? Does it mean being more skeptical of authority?
That's a great question, and it's something I think Bet David leaves open to interpretation. He certainly seems to be advocating for a more engaged and informed citizenry, but what that looks like on an individual level will likely vary depending on a person's values and experiences.
It's almost like he's giving us a framework for thinking about freedom, but it's up to each of us to figure out how to apply it in our own lives.
Exactly. He's planting seeds, sparking conversations, and encouraging us to think critically about the world around us. He describes this really powerful moment in the Army where he was watching Saving Private Ryan, and it just hit him like a ton of bricks, this wave of pride in being American, almost like a spiritual awakening.
And it's right after that that a fellow soldier gives him a Bible, right?
Yeah, and he describes it as a miracle, this life-changing event that led him back to faith after years of being an atheist.
It's a pretty powerful story.
It is, and he uses it to talk about the role of faith in American history and politics. He even points to, like, the unlikely election of Donald Trump and the appointment of 3 conservative Supreme Court justices as possible signs of divine intervention.
So he's connecting these personal experiences, historical observations, and spiritual beliefs to make his case. It's pretty fascinating. But does he offer any solutions? What are we supposed to do with all this?
Well, that's where his call to action comes in. He keeps saying that we need to be paranoid, but in a positive sense.
Okay, I gotta ask, what does that even mean, paranoid in a positive sense? It sounds kind of contradictory.
It's more about being vigilant and proactive. Like we can't just sit back and assume everything will be fine. Freedom isn't something that's just handed to us. It's something we have to constantly fight for and protect.
Even in a country like the U.S. where we have these strong constitutional protections.
Exactly. He even compares it to a basketball game. You can't just celebrate after scoring a few points. You got to keep playing hard until the final buzzer because the other team is always trying to catch up.
So the fight for freedom is never really over.
Right. And a big part of that fight, he says, is recruiting new voices, people who bring fresh perspectives and challenge the status quo. He mentions folks like Bobby Kennedy, Tulsi Gabbard, Elon Musk, Joe Rogan.
It's an interesting mix of people, for sure.
Yeah, he seems to be looking for folks who aren't afraid to shake things up, who will stand up for what they believe in, even if it's not popular.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. Gun control, silencing of dissent, the fragility of free speech, the U.S. Constitution, divine intervention, a call to action. It's a lot to digest.
It is. And while his perspective is certainly passionate and thought-provoking, it also raises some important questions, like how do we balance security with individual rights? Can freedom truly thrive in a world that's facing so many complex challenges and evolving threats?
It's tough.
It is. These are the kinds of questions we need to wrestle with as we try to navigate this increasingly interconnected and uncertain world.
It definitely makes you look at things a little differently. Like he's pushing us to step outside our comfort zones and really examine what we believe about freedom and what it takes to protect it.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're exploring these ideas that challenge us, that make us think. And ultimately, I think they help us understand the world a little bit better. But the real question is, what stands out to you from all of this?
Honestly, for me, it's that phrase paranoid in a positive sense. It's just so striking. I'm still trying to wrap my head around what that means practically. Does it mean being super aware of potential threats? Does it mean being more skeptical of those in power?
That's a great question, and I think Bet David leaves it open to interpretation. He's definitely advocating for a more engaged and informed citizenry. But what that looks like for each individual, that's going to vary based on their values and experiences.
It's almost like he's giving us this framework for thinking about freedom, but it's up to each of us to figure out how to apply it in our own lives.
Exactly. He's planting seeds, starting conversations, encouraging us to really think critically about the world around us.
Yeah, it definitely gives you a lot to think about. And that's kind of what we aim to do here on the Deep Dive, give you the information and the different perspectives so you can form your own conclusions.
Exactly. We don't shy away from the tough topics or the strong opinions. We just want to present a variety of viewpoints, question some assumptions, and hopefully spark some good discussion.
Right? Because at the end of the day, it's through these conversations and critical thinking that we can start to understand this crazy world a little bit better.
And hopefully even make it a little bit better.
So as you think about Bet David's arguments, consider this. How do his ideas resonate with your own experiences and your values? What are the potential consequences of his call to action, both for individuals and for society as a whole?
Those are some really good questions to ponder, I think, as you continue to explore these ideas that shape our world.
Definitely. And hey, we always appreciate hearing your thoughts, so feel free to share your reactions and any questions you might have on our social media channels.
Absolutely. We love hearing from you guys. It helps all of us learn and grow together.
Well, folks, that was a deep dive, wasn't it? Thanks for joining us as we explored Patrick Bet David's take on the things that make tyrants tremble. Until next time, stay curious.